Hey everyone, welcome to my panel today on analog and digital play in terms of board gaming. Thank you so much for coming. I know at least here in Chicago, it is 6 p.m., so it's just the dinner time, and I know we've got people coming from around the country, certainly, and around the world. I've seen in other panels, so I don't know what time it is where you are, but I appreciate you taking the time and spending an hour with me. My name is Paul Booth. I'm a professor at DePaul University here in Chicago. And I research things like media fandom and digital technology and board games and popular culture. And really, I guess my focus and what I like to study are kind of everyday pastimes and how do people make meaning, how do people explore and enjoy these things that often are not considered to be high culture, right? Why do people become fans? Why do people play board games? Things like that. And I'm also the author of a couple of books about board games. The most recent one is called Board Games as Media, and that's the talk that I'm kind of going to be focusing on today. Is I'm going to be drawing from some of the methodologies and some of the ideas that I wrote about in Board Games as Media to talk about the relationship between digital apps that are and the analog board games that use them. And Specifically, I want to focus on apps that are used within board gaming as opposed to apps that take the place of board games. So like, for instance, on my iPad, I could play Root, or on the table I could have a game of Mansions of Madness set up, and I'm having to use an app or I'm having to use a computer in order to play that board game, and it's that second one that I'm particularly interested in. I took as my starting place for thinking about this when I put this talk together, kind of the relationship between analog and digital in the board gaming hobby. And Aaron Trammell has this great quote. He has a great piece in Analog Game Studies. I highly recommend everyone check it out, where he says, although they're often posited as opposites, the analog and the digital are intimately related throughout the board gaming hobby. So you've got analog games that in the design process are using digital tech and using apps to create, or rather to design the game. In the production process, digital technology is used. And then in the gameplay. And while you have to use an app to play Mansions of Madness, you have to use an app to play World of Yoho, right? We actually use digital technology in all sorts of ways when we play. There's looking up rules. I in or looking up something that may not be in the rule book, but you want to see how other players have dealt with this particular situation, so you go to Board Game Geek and you look it up on your phone. I know whenever I play games with my partner, with my friends, we'll often put music on, and that comes at us through an app, that kind of atmospheric environmental stuff. And then apps are also can be integrated into the game. So while analog is often posited as this opposite to digital, one of the things that I want to really touch on in this talk is the idea that they're actually not that different, or rather, they are both integral to this relationship. So, that's what I'm going to be doing in this talk is kind of unboxing that relationship between analog games and digital apps. Um, I'm going to take us through four different kind of stages in this talk. The first one we might look at as kind of a traditional lit review, where I'm going to talk about some of the theories and some of the ideas that other people have come up with that help inform my thinking on this. I'm going to talk about an ethnographic survey that I did about a year and a half ago. Actually, no, 2 years ago at this point. It was April 2019. I did a survey and I had about 900 respondents talking about all sorts of different things in terms of board gaming, but specifically for this talk, they're kind of ideas about digital apps. I'm going to talk at the end about different types of apps and the way that apps can be integrated into games, and then have a couple of conclusions, which are not really conclusions, but more questions and thoughts about where we can go from here. I am still working on this. This is the first time I've presented this sort of research and this sort of work, so I'm really looking forward to the chat and seeing, some ideas that you all might have that maybe I haven't thought of before. The main thrust of my argument, or the main idea that I want to get across here, is that the use of digital companion apps in analog games makes them more in line with contemporary expectations of media, right? Well, like, they are more in line with what we might think of when we think about having an entertainment experience. But they also reduce the Wittgensteinian family resemblance to board games, right? Where Wittgenstein talks about the idea that we recognize something by its relationship to things that are like it, and apps kind of change that. In a way, this is a big duh, right? Like, that's that's not really that of an avant-garde observation or conclusion, but I think it's worth mentioning that it's not as clear-cut as digital apps change board games, but rather there is this continuum of familiarity and alienation from the kinds of gaming that we're used to. So let's get into it. In Board Games as Media, which was released January 2021, really fantastic time to release a book. If anyone is interested in the heyday of a pandemic, absolutely great time to have a book come out. But in Board Games as Media, I really took this kind of the main thrust of my argument there is what happens if we look at board games as if they were media texts. We often don't think of board games as media. We think of video games as media sometimes. We obviously think about film and television. Sometimes we think about books as media. But rarely do we think about board games as media. And so in the book, what I did is I said, okay, well, what is media? Media presents ideas about the world to us in ways that are understandable. They mediate, right, between one group of people, the creators, the designers, the people that are influenced by culture, and they mediate ideas to the audience. Board games do exactly the same thing. They are mediating ideas that the creators have, that the designers have, that the writers have, and as players, we experience those ideas. But board games are also different than what we think of as traditional media because they don't exist without players. And this is kind of the main argument of the book, that if I have a box, let's say I have Mansions of Madness on my table over there, right? In the box, it's just pieces. It's just minis. It's a board. It's some cards, quite a few cards. It's some dice. It doesn't actually become a game until the player is added. And that's different than traditional forms of media. A film exists, whether you watch it or not. It is there. It's a thing. And you interpret it, and you maybe think about it differently than other things. Maybe you think about it differently than your partner does. But it exists. It is a complete whole. A board game doesn't. A board game is only existent in that period of time where players are interacting with it. And so this was kind of the main conclusion that I came up with the book. The physical game is only half of the game text. The other half is the integration of players with the game. Therefore, board games as a text, as an idea, as a mediated form, exist somewhere between the material and the immaterial. They are a thing, they are an object, but they're also not an object. They are an experience. And like other media texts, they reflect aspects of the culture that created them. Certainly today we live in an era of board game glut, where we have so many thousands of board games coming out every year, that it only stands to reason that they are starting to form complex ideas with the culture that is creating them. And I think we're starting to see a lot of that in the newer games that are coming out. So I'm going to take each of these kind of theories in turn and talk about them in the context of digital apps. But what this did to the idea of board games as media in the book was it required a revision or revisitation of traditional media theories. So traditional media theory might be a textual analysis where we examine the text as communicating a message. Well, it doesn't quite do that the same way when the actual text, the actual board, is only half of that equation. So I had to revise that textual analysis to make it into something else, and I called that rather uncreatively ludotextuality. Right. And every chapter did similar things. I'm not going to cover all of those because this talk is only really concerned with the digital app aspect of it. But I talked about things like ethnography, diversity, equity, and inclusion in games, autoethnography, auteur studies, things like that. So let's take that first idea, right? That a board game is only half, the physical game is only half of the game text. The other half is that interaction that players have with it. And I called this a ludotextual analysis. That is the only way we can understand a board game in its entirety as a media text communicating something about the culture that it's from is by integrating textuality and participation as unified experiences. That is, we can't assume the game exists as a thing without also examining the players that are playing the game. Um, and this can boil down to it sounds like more complicated than it is, boils down to a pretty simple question, like what is a cube, right? In some board games a cube represents poverty. In some board games it represents wealth. In some board games it represents health. In some board games it represents wounds, right? It's the cube itself as a text doesn't mean anything unless it is also being interacted with, unless a player is actually using it for something. So this means that game analysis have to look at how similar textual elements combine with player interaction to help us understand this kind of underlying value, the underlying beliefs of the board game. Like, what does it mean? How are the creators trying to communicate messages to us? And what can we as players learn about the game? Therefore, the board game is a combination of the material and the immaterial. It is the game, it is also the play of the game. And I know, people have thought about this. I'm not the first person to have come up with this idea, but this has not been thought about in media studies before. This is not something that kind of media scholars have really discussed before. So in order to do any sort of discussion of the ludotextual analysis of board games, in order to understand how digital apps have some sort of effect within the game, we have to integrate ethnography, right? Ethnography, which is the study of people. We have to use multiple methods, textual analysis and ethnography, or autoethnography, which is the study of the self as an ethnographic subject. We have to use both in order to get a fuller understanding of the text. Another element of kind of game literature that I used to understand digital apps for this talk is Salem and Zimmerman's Rules of Play, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. It is a quintessential book. It is essential to understanding kind of game studies and, I would argue, media studies. But there's a point, there's an element of rules of play that I think is really relevant here, and that is how Salem and Zimmerman differentiate the kind of three areas where games have some sort of an impact. And they call them schemas, right? The largest schema is the rules, or sorry, not the smallest schema is the rules of the game, which is kind of the structure of the game, how the game is played. The play is this kind of experiential area that emphasizes the player's interaction with it, and all of that exists within a culture. Right, the culture of play, which informs how we play, right? So we sit a certain distance apart from each other because of the culture that we're in. There are cultural expectations. There are cultural ways to behave when you're playing a game. If you lose a game, right, culturally, you're not supposed to just kind of flip the board out of anger. Right. I mean, people do, and certainly we do on like Tabletop Simulator. But culturally, that's not an expectation. Ludotextuality, and this is why this is relevant for what I'm talking about here. Ludotextuality is that interaction between play and rules, right? It informs the way play and rules form within a particular culture. So it's kind of building off of what Salem and Zimmerman have done. The final elements that the final kind of research and scholarship that I wanted to use to do this this research comes from digital scholarship. And I mentioned at the beginning, I also research digital technology. One of the classic works of scholarship about new media and digital technology is Lev Manovich's The Language of New Media, in which he attempts to uncover what digital technology is saying about the world and define what it is, because it is actually kind of an amorphous subject. And he lists a number of different ways we can understand digital technology. It is digital. It's made of ones and zeros. It's modular, so it's like a Lego, right? It can build on each other in various ways. Everything is boxy. It's variable, so it can be randomized. It's automatic, so it doesn't have to use human interaction in order to advance. And this is a big thing. It's transcoded, which means there is a layer of cultural understanding that has to be translated. So the computer right now is showing you my PowerPoint slides and my picture in a little box and the logo of Twitch and all of that stuff. So that's modular, right? You've got all these building blocks, and Andy, who is controlling this, could move those around in a particular way. But it's also automatic, right? So once you've programmed it in to be a certain way, it's going to pop up in that way. It could be randomized, so you could set this Twitch stream up to randomly show something else. Thankfully, they're not. They're showing what I've put together. But this transcoded layer is really important, right? The code is unreadable to most people, right? The code that is putting all of this together. There's a layer of human cultural understanding between the machine language and our visual understanding of this that is making that connection. And for Manovich, that is a cultural layer, right, which is determining the difference between that machine language and the human language of understanding. It doesn't really matter a huge amount for my talk, but I think it's an important point to mention. And then the final thing, Benjamin Peters has a great piece called Digital, which is all about what the digital does. And what digital technology does is it counts things, it indexes things, and it manipulates things. And all three of these combined with, oh, sorry, wrong button. All three of these things combined with Manovich's 5 points of new media come together when we are looking at the interaction of digital apps and analog games. So I realize that was a very long kind of diatribe about some of the literature that has informed this, but I feel like it's really important to try and understand what actually a digital app is within a board game, right? It is an immaterial object. It is an intangible element because the digital is ethereal, right? It's ones and zeros. It doesn't actually exist as anything, but it's also a physical manifestation. You've got an actual phone that you're using. You've got an iPad. You've got a tablet or a computer of some kind. You've got a physical object. So it is physical. It's also immaterial. It's also ethereal. It's also intangible. So there's all of these things at play, all of these things coming together. When I surveyed 850 or so people about how they responded to digital apps within the board games, it was without a doubt the most mixed of all of the answers I got. I mean, I asked 20, 25 questions, and most of them came down on one side or the other of various things. You can see from the chart here, it is really split. Some people really don't like digital apps. Some people really like digital apps. Most people are kind of in the middle. And I think this is an important element because it's not that digital apps themselves ruin or make a board game great. Rather, it's how they're used. It's the particular use of the app that makes a difference. And we see this in a lot of the language that people used when they were describing it. Now, I'm not going to read all of these quotes. We don't have time for that, but just a couple of them. These are some of the negatives. Analog gaming provides an opportunity to unplug, which needs to happen more and more. Digital apps are gimmicky. Sometimes you want to disconnect. I want board gaming to be analog, not digital. So people that are very negative about digital apps are really contrasting it with that analog game experience, which is often social, face-to-face. It's interactive, it's participatory, right? So, excuse me a second. So it involves play, and it involves play with other people, and digital apps as media put up a layer between the interaction we have with other players. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. But some of the positive comments about apps change the idea of what apps can do. Here, keeps content fresh, new updates and releases. Broaden the experience, take care of the fiddly bits. If it can add something to the game, if it's used correctly, I like apps for games that take a lot of setup, teardown, and record keeping, so on and so forth. So it seems like for the people that were responding to this survey, at least, there were some really positive aspects that apps can bring, but some really negative ones. The negative ones are when the app is, jumped ahead a bit there. The negative ones are when the app tries to replace some of those integral social elements of board gaming. But the positive ones are when they replace some of the logistical or, dare I say, algorithmic aspects of board gaming. The things like making monster stats, figuring out, in a complicated game, what to draw and what not to draw. If you're hearing my dog barking over there, he is very excited at the moment. He loves board gaming with me. It's his favorite activity. That and squirrel hunting. So really what the survey demonstrated, and what the people in the survey kind of illustrated, was that there were three main types of digital analog game interaction, with a fourth one that kind of served as a category under which the others could also sit. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And those categories are, there's a game augmentation, there's optional content for games, there's integral content for games, and then there's fan-created apps that can do any of those things. Let me explore all of these in particular with some examples. So one of the elements of digital apps that came out in my survey was that apps could augment games. And an example of that, which came out more recently, but there are other examples of that, is Sleeping Gods, the Red Raven game, which, if you had kickstarted at a particular level, came with music that you could put on to augment your experience. It wasn't necessary, and it wasn't even part of the gameplay. Rather, it just augmented the larger social experience of the game. And apps like this found a lot. People found a lot of enjoyment. This was an app that people really enjoyed. A second category was optional content. So you have games like One Night Ultimate Werewolf or Alchemists, which work great with apps. The One Night Ultimate Werewolf app is fantastic. It really streamlines things. You don't have to use it. If you really didn't want to, you could make do without the app. And the same with Alchemists, right? If the game Alchemists uses this great kind of mastermind-like app to control the potions that you're making. But there's also an analog way to do it. It just takes a lot longer, and for a lot of the people that were participating in my survey, was unnecessary because it wasn't part of that social interaction that they really craved. So apps used in this optional content way works really well for the survey respondents. Then there were integral apps that had to be used with the game, that you couldn't play the game without an app. And this is where there were a lot of mixed ideas. Some of the examples, you've got Chronicles of Crime, where you have to use an app to kind of scan around. The aforementioned Mansions of Madness is kind of the quintessential example of using an app. Unlock has to use an app in order to solve the games. You've also got World of Yoho, where your phone is a excuse me, Your phone is a pirate ship and goes around this map and interacts with other pirate ships that are on there that are the other players. And the response to these in these the board games where digital apps were integral was very mixed. Some people loved it because it kept things fresh. Mansions of Madness, like every time you play it, it's new. It can change the map. It can change the things that are placed on the board. But sometimes, but people also didn't like the fact that they replaced social interaction. So, World of Yoho, for example, is the game takes place on the board, but half of it is you pick up your phone and then you're kind of staring at your phone and tapping things while the other players are kind of just looking around, but they can't use their phone because it's on the damn board. So there's kind of this, you're playing together but separately at the same time. Um, so for players that really enjoyed that social experience, that really enjoyed that interaction, that participation with other players, apps just don't cut it. Apps were not a great solution. The final category that kind of spans all of those are fan-created apps, and these are apps that you can are not put out by the game company, right? So, World of Yoho has its own app. Mansions of Madness, Fantasy Flight's done its own app, but this is a picture of some Gloomhaven characters, right? There's no, as far as I know, there's no Isaac Childress official app for Gloomhaven. If there is, please correct me in the chat. But what there are tons and tons of fan created ones that take the place of monster stats, take the place of keeping track of your character's XP throughout the game or throughout the campaign. And these were really often really liked by participants. These apps were really enjoyed because they could span all these different types. They often replaced things or automated things that creators didn't even think about. So what we really have from the ethnographic research that I did is that apps can streamline or augment the physical aspects of the game, right? They can streamline the playing of cards. They can streamline the rolling of dice. But the kind of automated screen runs counter to the play experience. So it can, in some ways, when it replaces that material or that textual aspects, when the digital becomes material, it seems to work really well. But when the digital, which is intangible, replaces the immaterial or the ludic, it doesn't seem to work very well. And I realize, that's a lot of terminology there. But I think that that's a really important point, that the app being digital is already an immaterial experience. And when it increases the immateriality of the game, it doesn't seem to really work well, or at least game players don't really seem to enjoy it as much. So, what are some of the conclusions we can come up with? What are some of the kind of discussion we can have? Well, that third point that I said at the beginning there, board games reflect the culture that created it and also reflects players' reactions to that culture. If board games always exist as this kind of textual object and player experience, then the digital's insistence on immateriality legitimizes that immaterial reality of the gameplay, meaning you don't need more immateriality. It's already there. And if you add more to it, it takes away some of that in-person social aspects that you like, right? It replaces that imagination of the game player. But we are seeing more and more digital apps in our board games. Why might this be? These are just some ideas that popped out of the ethnography I did, but also that I've been kind of toying with and thinking about. The popularity of board gaming as it has increased means more people are getting into the hobby, which means different types of games need to appeal to greater swaths of people. There's an attempt to get video gamers into the board game market, and using apps might be a way to do that. As I said earlier, there's a glut of games. We have something like 5,000 or 6,000 games being made every year. So there has to be something new. Some new mechanics have to be part of this. It has to be something to differentiate a game from every other game that comes out. An app is a great way to do that. It's sexy. It looks interactive. It can be very flashy, so it can really make a new game stand out in this glut of games. It also, and I alluded to this earlier, it also manifests a part of the game that's always been there. So, for instance, part of board gaming is this algorithmic element, right? There's a pattern and you follow it. There is a rule and you follow it. And following the rules is what makes the game. To go back to Salem and Zimmerman, the rules make the game. And so analog games are algorithmic. Digital apps being digital, being algorithmic, as Manovich points out, are automated, allows games to follow, or allows board games to follow these analog rules. And finally, analog games are participatory more than interactive. This is a differentiation. We often use the word participatory and interactive as synonyms. We often assume that they mean the same thing, but interactive is often more about a single player interacting with something, whereas participatory is more encompassing. So multiple people can change things, or a game state can change due to player interaction. And I think one of the strengths of analog games, and I know there have been other panels at this conference that have talked about this. One of the strengths of analog games is that very human element. You can house rule something if you want to. You can, if you're playing with a newbie, you can make it a little bit easier, and you can say, take out the 0 card, or you could draw twice and pick the one that works best because you want it to be a good gaming experience for someone who's never played before. Really hard to do that with a digital app in a game, though, because a digital app is interactive. It's not participatory. So what does this mean? Well, on the one hand, digital apps are a reaction to the increase of digital technology in our lives today. We have more digital tech in our lives. We're seeing it reflected in our everyday entertainment experiences. But board games themselves are an important social outlet that uses our brains in critical ways. Outsourcing that to digital technology often reduces the complexity of games, which for some players defeats the purpose. I'm going to cough again. I'm so sorry. So what are some of the other conclusions we can come up with? Well, there's a concept in media studies called demediation, which is the idea that our everyday entertainment experiences use overt mediation to replicate the idea that we live in an overt mediated experience. So, for instance, if you're watching a movie and no one in the movie, and it's contemporary, and no one ever uses their cell phone, you're going to be like, what the hell? Like, why is no one using their cell phone? That's a really simple solution to this problem, right? Media is demediated when the overt mediation becomes everyday. It becomes unnoticeable, right? And in some ways, digital apps are becoming demediated within board games. As they become more common, they're not becoming as unique or as different to see a demediated experience, or to see a digital experience within a board game. Digital apps also highlight this material immaterial tension in board games that has been around for a long time. We had DVD games, we had VHS board games, right? We had electronic games like Dark Tower. We've always, as long as there has been alternate forms of media, we've used those forms of media in board games to some success and some failure. Digital apps are just the latest line of this. It's not something completely new. It is something that has been happening for a while. And also, we have reached an experimental phase of analog games. We're seeing games with jigsaw puzzles. We're seeing games that can only be played once, right? The kind of legacy games or campaign games where you rip up cards, or escape room games where you rip up cards. Legacy games. There's a whole panel about legacy games, right? A unique games where every single type of game you get has been computer designed to be different than any other example of that game. So you get something like a new experience every time. Solo games, which has become very popular, especially in the pandemic. is a new way of experiencing board games in a way that is unlike what we've seen before. Serious games. Again, we've always had serious games. We've always had games with missions, games that are trying to communicate something, but now it's becoming much more common, right? We're seeing ecologically themed games. We're seeing games that are, anti-capitalist or games that are pro-capitalist. We're seeing a real intense push for DEI in games. Games are taking on kind of larger experiences than themselves. And all of this is experimental, right? All of this is not, it's not all new, but we're experimenting with the board game form in different ways. Digital apps play into that. And as I said, all board games are algorithmic, so apps are also just a natural outgrowth of board gaming as we have played it. So that's kind of the beginnings of my research. I'm not 100% sure where I'm going to go with that, but I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on for a little bit, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the chat. I've got it up on my iPad over here, so I can kind of see the chat. But Andy said he might also be able to discuss or send me the questions, because actually they're not popping up.
Sure. So,
And
yeah.
and
Let's start
yeah.
off with a good question here. Does the opinion on the digital apps graph, does that have a breakdown with age or gender? Did you see any correlations with that data?
That is a great question, and I have not looked into that yet. I'll say gender-wise, it will be difficult to make any sort of determination. The vast majority of people that took my survey were male. And I mean, that's a problem in board gaming generally. And the vast majority were in the kind of 40 to 50-year-old range. There were quite a few 20 to 30-year-olds, but most were 40s and 50s. But I haven't actually done that correlation yet. That would be the next step of this research. Great question, though. I'm thinking the same thing.
Okay. Next question. When are you expecting the book to come out?
The book is actually out. It came out January of 2021. So it is available. I mean, it's on Amazon and at all good booksellers. And yeah, and I'm happy to chat about. My email is down there and my Twitter is down there. So definitely get in touch. And if you do get the book and want to kind of chat about your ideas, it's definitely, I view it as like I don't want to say a work in progress, because it's not, it's completed, but it is also just kind of like my first step thinking about this, and I'm not done thinking about it. So I want to keep talking about it. But yeah, the book came out. It was really interesting. I wrote it pre-pandemic and sent it off to the publisher, and academic books take like a year or so to come out, and then a pandemic happened. And when it came back, some of the notes from the peer reviewer were like, you might want to, tone down your jokes about Pandemic, the board game. I'm like, yeah, I think I will.
Okay. We have a question here in the audience. They consider it a long shot here. Can you imagine any relationship between your two-part view of board games as texts and Bogot's Simulator Fever?
Um, yeah, I mean, one of the things about Bogost is he writes so much about video games, and part of what I wanted to do with board games as media is take it out, view board games as something different than video games. And in some ways, it's a very artificial separation, because I mean, I think you can view things on a continuum, especially when you're talking about digital apps and things like that, which are already problematizing that relationship. Um, but I think that I really tried to avoid making those sorts of video game comparisons, because I do view video games differently. I think the fact that you can't affect the game itself, that you're playing along a path that's been programmed, um, is a fundamental difference. And I know there's degrees and a continuum of interaction there. Um, that is a long-winded answer to say I haven't specifically thought about it. But that actually would be a really interesting place to go with this research on digital apps, because it is verging into the video game. So looking more at that kind of simulator, or looking more at simulator fever would be useful. So I hadn't thought of it, but it's a great suggestion.
Okay, Melissa in Australia here adds that in her work, we found that women were fractionally less likely to embrace these hybrids, but also had the issue of many men.
Yeah. If I had to guess, I would say women would be less likely to embrace digital apps. What I did correlate with gender when I was doing the research was what types of games do people enjoy, and women and non-binary people far and away preferred cooperative games and social interaction in games, and apps reduce that. And so I would guess that would be what I would find. Um, so yeah. But I hear you on having difficulty finding women. And also I mean I did also talked about race. And that's even more extreme. It was like 94% white that took my survey, which is, really problematic.
Okay, Tanya in the comments uh, compliments you, says she loves your book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I love your work. If you're the Tanya that I think you are, I've
Yep,
used you in
Dr.
a lot of things, so I appreciate it. And I liked your talk yesterday.
And she says, do you think board games will change forever because of the digital hybridality slash digitization that became necessary and critical during the pandemic, or will there be a roaring 20s of in-person, old-fashioned analog play?
I think it'll be both, and I don't mean that to be a cop-out answer. But I think the pandemic has made things like board game arena, tabletop simulator, tabletopia, right? It opened that up to a lot more people, who may not have considered doing that before it became a life or death decision. And I'm serving on a dissertation committee, um, um, and he's writing about board games, and I don't know if Greg is in the chat or not, but he argues that I was gonna give a quote, but now I've lost it. So I think it's gonna be both. I think it has opened up the idea of board gaming to people online, to people who wouldn't even consider it. But I think there's also going to be a resurgence of people who are like, I have missed being in person. Right? Given the choice, I would rather be in person. When I didn't have a choice, I would rather play board games, and do it in a digital way. Um, so I think what we're going to see is more people kind of doing one night a week online and then meeting friends the rest of the time. But what do I know? Like, if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be an academic.
Okay, next question is from Will. How do you think game apps meant to be used with physical games relate to the computer games designed to look or act like board games?
Oh, that is a really good question. And one I kind of deliberately sidestepped. You will notice, by not at all talking about board game apps. Um, um, I'd have to do a lot more thinking about that, Will. It's a great question, because I think there is a fundamental difference. Um, before this talk, I was playing a board game in person with my partner. Before that, I was playing a game on my iPad that was a board game version of or that was a video game version of a board game. And they're both enjoyable, but I think that the in-person socialization aspect of playing the game with my partner in person at the table and making jokes and like yelling at her when she kicked my ass, um, is part of the fun. And I I don't know if we get that with a digital version of a board game. I think it becomes much more like a video game, even though there are some similarities. And that is not a value judgment, right? Because I think there is a place for those sorts of games. I love playing my Scythe on my computer, and I love playing Root on my iPad, right? And Pandemic, and then the fact I could play a game of Scythe in 20 minutes is pretty outstanding. Um, but I do, it's not the same game for me. It is just a different game. It would be like reading a novel and then watching the movie, right? They both can be really good, but they're different experiences, and you expect different things out of them. Um, I'm sorry I kind of sidestepped that question. It's a great one, and I haven't really fully dealt with it yet.
Okay, we have our next question from Paul. Thanks for the great talk. Is there anything specifically analog about the Ludotextual? And as a follow up, do game texts differ from non game texts in the sense of having to be played or read to be concretized, as Ingarden puts it in his reading of texts?
Ooh, okay. I may have to get you to repeat the second half of that question.
Yeah, it's in text, chat, and you can read it.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. So, is there anything specifically analog about the ludotextual? Yes, absolutely. I think uh, the way that the way I think about the ludotextual is that it exists as this combination of the physical game and then the player's interaction with that game. And so the analog is integral to that, in a way that you don't see in other forms of media. Like, you don't see it with video games, because the video game has already determined for you what the various objects and things are. You have there's a game of Scythe, right? And you've got these mechs going. Oh no, actually, this is a better example. Anachrony was one of my favorite games. If you know Anachrony, you can play that game with little cardboard standees of your guys, or you can play it with these plastic mech models. It makes no difference to the actual game, right? But to the actual gameplay. But there is a qualitative difference to playing with the mechs as opposed to with the little pieces, or the little cardboard pieces. In another piece I've written, where I talked about Kickstarter and like the materiality of Kickstarter, you know, whenever there's a Kickstarter, the most for a board game, the most pledged category is the one where you get the most stuff, because that's part of the game and it's part of the fun. And that's the ludotextual, right? Is it's not just textual, it's your interaction with that text. It's your touching it, it's your playing with it, it's your moving it. So I'd say the whole thing is analog. Second part of your question, do game texts differ from non-game texts in the sense of having to be played, read, to be concretized? Yes, I think they do. I'll go back. I'm a as a media scholar. My area's audiences and reader reception theory is really big in that aspect of media studies. And so, what reader reception theory says is, when you're watching a movie, when you're reading a book, the interpretation, your reaction to it, is part of the text. That the film doesn't get meaning until it has been watched, right, by you. But a board game literally isn't anything until it's played. It is just pieces in a box. It's just a board with drawings on it. It's just cards with pictures. Um, a film exists as a film. Your interpretation of it might change, your reader response might change, uh, and it can take on new meanings. The Room, right, is not the serious drama that Tommy Wiseau thought it was. It is a hilarious comedy, and we know that now. And that was because of audiences, right? We changed it. We changed that film, even though the film itself didn't change. We changed it. But I could open up a box of Pandemic, and I could rewrite the whole thing, where the cubes suddenly are they're not diseases anymore, they are cures. And yeah, and in fact, actually, this is what happened in the legacy version of Pandemic, right? The actual mechanics of the game, the actual elements of the game could change, so it's not even the same game anymore. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but yes, to concretize the a board game, I think is different, fundamentally different than actualizing our ideas about a media text. Great question, though.
Okay, I'm going to throw in one of my own here. How do you feel theme impacts those different elements? I know that theme can change how a game is presented and feels. A simple game with no theme versus a bad theme for a game or a good theme can really make the difference. How do you feel that impacts those different elements?
That is a great question, and I actually wrote about theme and mechanics in a different chapter of board games as media. So I dealt with this a little bit in the book. Um, Theme is absolutely crucial, right? And it is crucial, I think, to understanding board games as media. I think it's very difficult to see board games as communicating something if there isn't a theme behind it. Um, it's not impossible, but I think for your average board gamer, it, it's much easier to say, oh, terraforming Mars is actually saying something about the culture that made it, right? This is an example I use in the chapter. In terraforming Mars, they're corporations, right? Why? They could have been non-governmental agencies. They could have been um, colonist groups. They could have been aliens. But very deliberately, they're corporations colonizing Mars, and that's a deliberate choice, and that means something, right? And it your interpretation of what it means could be different than my interpretation of what it means, but the theme, right, and how all of those elements play into the theme is telling us something about the contemporary culture that from which terraforming Mars emerged. Um, so theme is absolutely crucial to developing, I think, an understanding of what messages board games are communicating. Um, Andy, remind me what the first part of your question was, because I kind of got off on a tangent. I was excited you mentioned theme.
No, I think you answered it pretty well. That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of elaborate a little bit. Oh, he's my dog has come in. Just to elaborate a little bit, Pandemic works so well because you're cooperating to solve a big problem, right? It wouldn't work. It wouldn't be the same game if you were all cooperating to murder somebody, right? Yeah, I'm not saying that would be a bad game, but it changes the game, and that's the ludotextual, right? You could use all the same pieces, you could use all the same mechanics, you could virtually use the same theme, but the interaction with it changes what the game does, hypothetically.
Okay, next question here. This is the last I think that we're going to end up with. How do you feel about the practice of reading rules as an end in itself? And that's from Melissa in Australia.
Oh, Melissa, that's awesome. I think I know which Melissa this is, and I also like your work very much. Reading rules is I don't have a whole lot of research on this. It wasn't something that really came up in my surveys a huge amount. From personal experience, I love reading rule books. And one of the things I love about reading rule books is imagining how the basically the algorithm that I'm learning is going to actually play out in real life. I imagine I'm not a programmer, I'm not a computer person particularly like that, but I imagine it's the same feeling someone gets from like putting together code and then hitting enter and then seeing it work, right? That's what I like about rule books. That to me though isn't the game, right? That's part it is part of the game, obviously it's part of the game experience, but the game is what happens when those rules are enacted. And reading the rules and understanding the rules is like preparation for the game. And in the same way that a recipe is not a meal, right? That when I put all the pieces of a recipe together and lay them all out on the counter, like individually they might be delicious and I love the way they look, but they are not creating a meal, right? The meal is what happens when they come together and I sit down with or without other people and eat them. So that's the rules for me. However, that's just a personal feeling, and I haven't done any academic work that would support that. If you have, I would love to hear about it.
Okay, we're going to sneak in one last question here.
Yeah, I will try not to be long-winded on this one.
Okay, so this is actually a kind of longer question. Wanting to know if there's should be a harder or faster distinction between video games and board games, based on how the observable features of a video game indicate how we should take the meaning of visuals or events when we encounter them, what goals we should take, what activities we should engage in, and how we should use it.
Um, that is a very good question. I'm gonna read it on the chat just to make sure.
Yeah, I did
that
kind
I'm
of
understanding
reorganize
it.
that a little bit. Sorry.
No. It's just a little complicated. Okay. Um, I personally I like the shades of gray. I like I like things that you aren't easily as an academic. I like things that aren't easily categorized. World of Yoho. I like I I'm just speaking personally, I don't love the game, but I love the idea that it is kind of a video game and it's also kind of a board game. And that's kind of cool. It also kind of sucks, but it's also kind of cool. Um, that's just me personally. Your mileage may vary on that. So I shy away from saying yes. We should say things are video games or things are board games, but I also think that there are characteristics that are video game characteristics, and you bring up great ones there about visuals and assigning meaning to visuals and things like that. And then there are characteristics that are very board game characteristics that I would say, you know, when you play a board game, this is what you might expect. This is the kind of experience you're going to have, and the same with you. There's a kind of experience you're going to have, and so I like to think of things on a continuum. So any particular game might be more on the board game side than the video game side, and very few video games are going to be at all on the board game side, but some might, right? I'm thinking of something like Lego Dimensions, which is, 5, 7 years old now. Um, but that had characteristics that we could associate with board games. It was material, you could manipulate it, you could move things around. So I like to think of things on a continuum where we can place the video gameness and the board gameness. And one of the reasons I like studying apps in board games is because it deliberately challenges what we think of as video game or board game. Thank you for the question. That was a great question.
All right, and we're just about finished up here. So why don't you tell people where they can find you, where they can buy your book again, any other details you want to throw in?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I'm on Twitter at pbooth81. Although most of my tweets are going to be pictures of my dog, who is very photogenic. So enjoy. And I'm on email pbooth at depaul.edu. Board Games is Media, and my other board game book is called Gameplay. Both of them are available on Amazon, as well as they're published by Bloomsbury, so you can go to the Bloomsbury Press website and get them there. And like I said at the beginning, I love chatting about stuff, and so do please get in touch. If you teach a class about board games and you want to assign board games as media, or even just a chapter or two, I'm happy to zoom in and chat with the students as well. The book emerged out of my board game class and the conversations I was having with my students. And so I hope it will be useful for yours. So thank you all very much.